Embroideries by Nadine Aisha Jassat. Auntie sent a table runner from South Africa, hand embroidered. Auntie, you left the pins in. They caught my fingers in the unwrapping. Look here. Can you see the marks?
And you have just heard the voice of Nadine Aisha Jassat reading from Let Me Tell You This, which is her latest collection of poems. Hello, Nadine.
Hi.
And so the collection is out now.
Yes.
On 404 Inc. And now that it is out, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about, one, how you feel about it now, and has it kind of fulfilled what your aims were for this collection of poetry?
I think now that it's out, it's definitely quite a surreal moment in time because you're going into bookshops and you're seeing your book and your words and you're thinking, oh my goodness, anybody could buy it.
And hopefully everyone will.
And hopefully they will. So you've got my first plug and we're only a minute in. But certainly it's a very exciting time. And for me, this book, as you can tell from the title, Let Me Tell You This, it was all about an expression of voice. So to know that it's out there and it's connecting with other people is a huge thing. And to see the reviews from people like Jackie Kay has just been absolutely phenomenal.
I mean, it has been very well received. But I guess the difficult thing might be when, as you say, it's out and anyone can read it. Because usually when people send these things to reviewers and stuff, they kind of think, I think you're going to like this. It's going to be aimed at people in that way. What has the feedback been like, general feedback? Have you had any yet?
Yeah, the feedback's been great. And I've had like a couple of people sort of sending me pictures of it on Twitter, like from all over the place, and not, just friends, but people that I don't know saying, I'm loving this and I'm loving the language and I'm loving the words. And it's very exciting, but at the same time, I'm trying not to get too caught up in what other people say about it because I don't want to give too much weight to other people's thoughts. I want to be like, this, right. Yeah, this is my intention. This is what I wanted for it, and then sort of let it go and not get dragged too much into what other people think. Because that's a spiral that you can go down.
Yes, absolutely. I remember we did one of these with your label mate, for want of a better word, Chris McQueer, and he was saying how his earlier reviews were really good. And then he read one that wasn't as good, and it really knocked him. And he said he was surprised himself how much it knocked him. So he just decided, I'm not going to read any, whether it's good, bad. I'm just kind of not going to do it. And I think that idea of almost protecting yourself is quite an interesting one for a writer or anyone kind of putting art out there. I think particularly because you touch on themes such as domestic violence and race. Did that kind of worry you that these are topics obviously that some people are all too keen to stick their oar in and discuss?
Yeah. Well, so I think a lot of the poems about gender-based violence I'd released through my poetry pamphlet Still. So I'd already had like a little taste of them being out in the world, but because Still was with a much smaller publisher, I don't really think that many people outside of Scotland will have read it. So whilst it was a little taste, it wasn't the full whack of exposure that this is. But at the same time, I think, like I said, it was the story that I wanted to tell, and you do have to find that line within yourself of, are you going to not tell the story then because you're scared of what other people will say? Yeah. But I think exactly as you said about Chris, about drawing that line and not reading the reviews, because I know that I would hone in onto something and overthink it and overthink it and overthink it. So I am trying to kind of think, right, you've done that now and it was wonderful, but you've done it. And then now let's look ahead and keep that momentum and that movement almost, so that I don't get stuck in any one place at any time.
It does, for me, what the best literature should do, and it kind of walks that fine line between recognition for a reader and giving readers something new and putting them in the shoes of other people, viewing other people's lives, and more importantly, I think understanding other people's lives better than that. You've got a lot of things about family, which we'll touch on, which I think most people, if not everyone, will be able to find something that. And then you have other things which are personal to you, very much personal to you. How did you structure all these kind of different strands?
So I guess, interestingly, before I fully answer that question as well, there was something that you said just there about that recognition, and that the political elements being woven through the personal and being in someone else's shoes. And I think for me, when I wrote the poems, I was writing them for myself.
Yeah.
And then it's only after, once you have written them, that you're like, actually, this does let people into my shoes and my world. And there is something in that exchange that's incredibly powerful. But at the first moment of writing them, I was writing them for myself. And then it was when it came to the ordering and putting the order together that I really did think about, how do these tell a particular story, and not just for me, but also a story of racism and resilience to it.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a poem in the collection which is called Pocky Hands, which is about how this racial slur was used and how I felt about it and how I felt quite silenced by it but then pushed back. And when I structured that in the collection, I put it directly before a poem that followed, which was called Holiday Snaps, which is about my aunt's hands and the warmth that I feel towards that, so that you get the violence of the racism, but you also get the resilience and the love that comes from family, and that resilience and love that is needed to sustain you through not just racism, but also from living so far away from family, from being separated across geography. Yeah.
And I think, you're saying it tells it a story and tells your story, and that's actually how I read it. It read it from start to the end, almost like a through narrative, but also the way the poems feed into each other. So the way that you've maybe viewed a poem when you read it the first time, then something else, as you say, will come after it, or even quite a few after it. And you go, I want to go back and read that again, because I think these are connected. And there does seem, I suppose you're the connection. That's it and everything. Poetry collections often don't work in this way. They don't tell a story in this way. Was that something that you set out to do?
I think that's just who I am. I think there's something interesting, because I'm not coming to poetry from a particularly academic place, or a place where I have read lots and lots and lots of different poets' connections and know the do's and don'ts. I came to poetry because there were stories that I wanted to tell, and so there's no, as most poets do, and so there's no surprise, I guess, to me that let me tell you this is that story from start to finish. It starts in childhood and family and ends very much with a sense of finding voice, but goes backwards and forwards. So for me, I guess I see it as a piece of storytelling, first and foremost, and a poetry collection as well. But certainly my intention was very much that it should be read one poem after the other, start to finish. Not only because it took me ages to order it, it took ages, so much pain. Yeah.
And it's split into 3 sections. You've got hands, words, and voice. And hands is an interesting choice. Words and voice, you might expect from a poet. Yeah. So explain why hands is the first section in it.
So I think I'm just a bit fixated on hands. I think I noticed when I read my work back and read my work through, even before this, that hands came up again and again and again in the poems that I was writing, and that there was something about hands that I was fixated on in terms of how they express a person or connection between people. And then when it came to naming that first section, it was because I felt not only is hands a way that we tell a story, or that I tell a story, but that also hands captured that family love and resistance, the family hands, as well as the violence that comes from other people's hands as well. And it seemed to have that perfect duality. And so, it seemed the right one to start with.
It is interesting, because I hadn't thought about it, and then, I'm doing it right now. I've got hands, but wide apart, and it is such an important part of any kind of conversation. As you say, they can indicate violence, they can indicate welcomeness, and it's a great opening section to the collection as well, because you introduce us to, I suppose, characters who in different ways come and go throughout. You've got your father and your mother, and they return to them, and that's, I think, the sections that a lot of people will identify with. Maybe it would be nice to read something from that section. Yeah,
I could read. So the Old Codgers captures my mother's and father's voices and their accents.
Perfect. Yeah,
so
that would be great.
I can read that one. And I always like to say when I read the Old Codgers that it was named by my mother. So I said to her, I wrote this poem when I was in Cape Town with my auntie and cousin, and I said to my mum, I've written this poem about you and Dad and about your accents, what should I call it? And she goes, just call it the Old Codgers, just name it after us. So the Old Codgers. My parents' mouths pull at the corners of mine. A tug I'll try share with yours if I sing to their tune. My father's is a dance of Hindi meets Shona meets Gujarati meets Afrikaans, where a woman is a honey, a child a lighty, and heaven help you if you hear footsec, kutri or woe. I grew up fluent in the tightened jaw of the old Bali on the phone. Hello, this is Mr. Jassat speaking. His accent so suddenly English from a county we'd never visited, never mind own. Me mother, all Yorkshire, all drawn-out vowels, calls a poem a poem and greets auntie with a rounded mouth and the India of her mind pressing on her tongue. She releases each sentence as a question, punctuated by an outside laugh that makes me want to ask who it is when it's at home. And I say oat and note and summerton in it. I say lychee, not lychee, samosa, not samosa, and I and arse and loo and snicket. Bath is never bath, room is never rum, and when I greet you, I may say, now then, just like my mum, and when I leave you, I may say, assalamu alaikum.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
I think so relatable as well. This particular, all I can say is my reaction to it, but there's certain words that you're not supposed to say because, it's not up here. They used to say, it's not the Queen's English.
Exactly.
And yet, you heard them in the playground or you heard them, at home or something like that. But what I rarely heard until I started to get into kind of Scottish literature and Scottish writers was it on the page or done, use it artistically. Was it the same for kind of, the language that you grew up with?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why, part of how I came to poetry and to being a writer of poetry was through spoken word, and through how people spoke and read. So I used to watch a lot of Andrea Gibson, who's a US poet, on YouTube. I'm a huge fan of Holly McNish and how she does use real language and real themes. And I think I found that it's okay to write about the everyday, really empowering. And with the old codgers, what's interesting is the language in there, and I talk about this in the glossary, the language in there is not just sort of Hindi words or Shona words or Gujarati words, it's also Jassat family interpretations of those words. So, for example, the word kutri in that would have originally been taken from kutta, which is Hindi, which means like bloody dog, but because part of my dad's family would have migrated through India via Zimbabwe in this complete different mix of everything, that the word got translated somehow to kutri. And I don't know if that is a Zimbabwean thing or if that is just my family thing. And so when it came to putting together the glossary and thinking about language, I was like, I want this to be a glossary of the words that I use in relation to my family and nothing else.
I think the glossary is fantastic because it could almost be read as a poem itself.
Well, there you go. Maybe we should market it like that.
Because the one at the end, there's a term, woe, a term used for burdensome relationships. For example, in-laws are often constructed or referred to in this way, as taught by the old Bali, often met with a humorous eye roll by my mother. And that's just a fantastic image.
Thank
that's
you.
almost an image in itself, isn't it? Just going, oh no, not again.
Yeah. I wanted that like heart and that family and that truth to my own voice and my own experience to run right through, right through the collection.
It's also a very honest collection of poems, and one which again struck a chord with me is, well, there was two actually, Inheritance and Let Me Tell You, both of which I think seem to deal with anxiety, which is something I've had struggle from time to time, and there's a lot I'd like to ask you about that, and maybe we could hear one later on, but you are a performance poet, and yet, it's about anxiety.
Yeah.
And, and I always think, I do things like this, record podcasts and cheer events and all that, and I suffer from anxiety and panic attacks and things like that. And I sometimes think, why did I do it? But I have this compulsion to do it. So what is it for you that you want to get up and, speak to a room full of strangers and read your poetry?
But I think as well, for me, the anxiety is not necessarily in the public speaking. Like, everybody's anxiety is their own personal beast, And
often difficult to work out exactly what that beast is.
Yeah, exactly. And usually I actually find that with anxiety, when I try and trace it back, so say if we use public speaking as an example, say, I feel really anxious about this public speaking. Why do you feel anxious about that? I'm anxious about what people think of me. Why do you feel anxious about that? And when you trace it back and unpick it, the root is actually something very different to where you are just now. And so in some ways, I guess there's something, I try and be a hippie, and like when my anxiety is really bad, I try and like embrace it and be like, thank you, anxiety, for giving me the opportunity to learn about these things and release them. But it's very hard to do that because at the time it just feels awful.
Yes.
But I think with the collection of stuff, anxiety hasn't really been around public speaking. It's more just been about when it's there and it's out, it's no longer in your control.
Yeah.
And I think with anxiety and loss of control is so key that it's a new thing to get used to. It's a new thing to say, thank you, anxiety, but we're going to release this now.
Well, I think in a way that's absolutely right, because you have to face up to it yourself, I think, before you can come to terms with and talk to other people about it like we are doing now. Because I know when I was at my worst, I couldn't have been able to discuss it. Yeah. And when you do tell people, when they say, what have you got to be anxious about? And you think, do you know what, I'm not really sure myself, but I know I am. I know there's something going on here.
And it's very consuming. I think like if you don't have anxiety, you maybe think, it's just feeling like a bit anxious. But it's something that physically affects your body. It's that sort of, for me, it's that spiraling of thoughts, which is what I kind of wanted to capture in Inheritance a lot as well, of it's this cyclical spiral that it feels so hard to wrench yourself out of. And I think if you haven't experienced it, you don't necessarily, know what that is like. But also I think for me, there's just such a sense of validation when other people who have experienced it speak about it. Yes. Or when other people say, acknowledge that you might be feeling that way, because suddenly at least the stigma's gone, but also, like I said, it's that validation, it's that how I'm feeling, it is okay to feel this way, and it takes away the shame.
Yes, that's right. And it's like you were saying, the collection, you wrote it for yourself, but then you find out that other people relate to it, and I think that's the same with discussing any mental health problems. You think, oh my God, this is me, and actually you find out there's so many other people that it's affected. Would you read Inheritance? Would that be
Yes,
okay?
Of course. Would you like me to give like a little... There's a wee intro backstory to Inheritance.
Yes, definitely, because I want to comment on that afterwards. Yes.
So with Inheritance, whenever I get a little bit too anxious, I do this thing, which is a very Yorkshire thing, of going and having a word with myself. And I'm like, I've just got to have a word with myself. I'll feel better. I'll just have a word with myself and it'll be okay. And I was talking to my mother on the phone about anxiety, and then she said whenever she feels anxious, what she does is she goes and has a word with herself. And I just thought... It really struck me that here was this moment where me and my mum had never really talked about this shared experience before, but also to know that we were using the same language to describe it without knowing, I found incredibly powerful. So I came back and wrote this poem, Inheritance. She calls it having a word with herself. My mother, looking at me, saying all the things she needs and doesn't. Fear does what it's supposed to hold you tight, until a word with yourself is the only way you can try to pause the descending, spiraling, tapping, trapping, paralysis, but for the beating fist, what if? But then, if I don't, if I do, anxiety. 4 syllables given to this ceaseless connecting string, this genetic, chemical, taut, inherited, threaded, parallel between my mother and me. My mother and me. Threaded parallel between this genetic, chemical, taut, inherited anxiety. 4 syllables, given to this ceaseless, connecting string, what if? But then, if I don't, if I do, paralysis but for the beating fist, spiraling, tapping, trapping. You can try to pause the descending until a word with yourself is the only way to hold you tight. Fear does what it's supposed to, and doesn't. Saying all the things she needs, my mother. Looking at me, she calls it having a word with herself.
And that's really interesting, because that conversation with your mother talking about it, I had a similar one in my life, and where these end stories came out from my mum saying, I used to have to leave shops because I didn't know why, but I was suddenly sweating and I was suddenly, you know, I've got fear and all this. So well, I never knew this. Well, I wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
So, you know, so I wasn't talking about it and she didn't talk about it. And then suddenly there was this shared experience that actually kind of brought us closer together, a greater understanding kind of each other. And there's lots of examples of that in the book as well, because there are lots of family ties, as we mentioned, but particularly I think between mother and daughter is a really strong one. So much so that it got me thinking, there's stuff written about fathers and sons, and there's lots of stuff written about mothers and daughters. It's not a lot about mothers and sons in the same way, in that kind of closeness, you know, that they have, and I think in many ways that's a shame.
Yeah, but that's a really interesting observation actually, because you're right, and I'd never thought of it like that.
And often it was, you know, similar things, you know, whether it was cooking or whether it was, you know, learning to sew or all these things, you know, which were kind of done together. We could talk a little bit about your family's kind of role in the book as such, and obviously it's in your life, but there's a few poems which are just kind of really dig down into those.
Yeah. So I tend to think, like I said, there's 3 sections to the collection, and the first 2 sort of deal a lot with family. I guess the first one, family show up as a form of heritage and connection and resilience. And then in the second one, it is that personal women's relationships in families. And it looks at, so there's a poem in there called Sam, which is on the face of it about my little brother, and he's called Samir, but he went through this phase of being like, I'm called Sam. And obviously there's political elements of the poem about that, but also the ultimate crux of it is he was named Samir because he was named after my grandmother. And so if he shortens that, he shortens the story of the women he was named after. And so, yeah, I think the storytelling of women and the storytelling of women's voices in my family felt very important because they're the voices that are often not heard and the voices that are often not valued. And I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to capture it with intelligent poems, but also with love as well.
And because there's an incredible warmth throughout the collection, but there's also underlying anger as well. And it comes in different, not stages is the wrong word, but there's different levels of it. There's ones where, you know, it's kind of very obvious, but the way you've been treated, hopscotch is a great example of that, which we'll maybe talk about afterwards. But then even something like when you're, let's say something like Threads, which is a beautiful poem, and your grandmother, isn't it?
Yes, it is,
but you can all feel underneath, you know, these people's voices have not been heard, and that's wrong, fundamentally wrong. That's the case. Was that something you were aware of all your poetry? You think that's something that's there constantly?
Yeah. I mean, I would say the theme of voice definitely runs throughout all of it, and I think you can tell that I'm a massive feminist as well, and so I'm really marking this women's voices not having been heard, but also I think there's an element of the connection as well where I guess I deal with that slightly playfully to give a different side of the story. For example, there's poems like Bite, which on the surface of it looks like a retelling of Snow White, but from her perspective, you know, of what was it like actually to live with these 7 men who just made you do all the housework, and you know, what was it like to be kissed when you were asleep without your consent. And that's how it begun, but then it ended up in the process of making it a much wider poem about rape culture, and about taking your voice back. And I think this thing of voice and reclaiming voice and giving voice to something that's not talked about definitely runs through all the poems for me. What's interesting about Threads though is that I think that's the one poem where voice isn't, it's not the one poem, a lot of poems where voice isn't political, but with Threads the relationship with voice there is so personal because it's about her slipping away through Alzheimer's, and I call her my time traveller, you know, she's slipping away across time, and the poem almost wants to sit as this connection between her travelling through time and me being placed here, and this bridge connecting the two of us. And the voice of the poem, I guess, is that bridge. The voice of the poem is that connection. You know, it's those words on the page which capture her and capture the moment. And
it's one of the poems where the words on the page matter how they look as well as how they sound. You know, it's written. How would you describe it?
So in the poem, certain words are, in terms of the form, spaced or they drop off. And I think this is about showing where there would be the gap in her knowledge and in her understanding because she's time travelling or because she's visiting in and out with her Alzheimer's. So I tried to stage it to really try and capture some of this experience of what it's actually like speaking with somebody who's experiencing Alzheimer's or dementia.
I guess looking at it now, it's maybe one of the poems, as I was saying earlier on, that the other poems started to impact my reading of it. Because you know, when I first read it, I thought this is just a very warm story of someone remembering their grandmother or celebrating their grandmother in that way. And then as you read on, you think, well, actually, no, there's something more going on here. But I guess that's one of the great things about the collection is that there's all these different levels going on at any time. So actually, as a reader, you do start to kind of layer them up into these things. And we mentioned Hopscotch, and that's one of the more powerful poems. And again, it looks a certain way on the page for a reason. It's kind of all broken down into individual lines which are not linear. They move across the page. So could you explain a little bit about Hopscotch?
Yeah, so Hopscotch is a poem that I wrote. I mean, I wrote it back in 2014 now, I think, and it is made up of all different words that men have said to me on the street. So the reason, for example, on the page that it sort of skips here and there is to really emphasize this feeling of these words coming at you from all sides. And it really felt that, you know, anybody who's experienced street harassment and who's experienced like racist, sexist, Islamophobic things said to you on the street, it can feel so voiceless in the moment because you're shocked, you're scared, you don't feel that you can speak back. And then further after that, you might say to somebody, oh, this happened. And the person you tell the response might be victim blaming or minimizing. And I think for me, I just found it incredibly silencing. I found it incredibly silencing that I was walking around with all of these words that other people had said to me on me that they didn't even give a second thought about, likely. And so Hopscotch came about as my way of wanting to take the power back, I guess. And like I said, I felt that was at a time where I was very much, I was writing my poems for me, I was writing to be cathartic. And so the form in Hopscotch, it wasn't necessarily even conscious, it just came out naturally like that as what I felt it needed to be.
Right.
And then at the end, when I looked back on it, I was like, actually, you've really captured something here. Yeah. And then it was adapted into a film. Into a wee film poem. Yeah, there's a film poem of Hopscotch, and it's got my face, but they've got there's a voice actress who's got a Scottish accent, because there's so many resources, right, that are used, because it's used in stuff like used in schools now,
really?
and so many resources are used by someone with an English accent, right, and I think they wanted a Scottish accent, but yeah, it's my face, and it was filmed in Edinburgh and made by a director called Oksana Vilk, who it was wonderful to work with, so that's exciting as well, to see it in its different incarnation,
Where would people find that?
Oh, you can get that on YouTube. Yeah, if you put in Hopscotch Nadine Aisha Jassat, you'll get the trailer and the film.
Oh, excellent.
So yeah,
I'll put a link to that on the website.
Oh no, please do. It's hard hitting. It's powerful.
Yeah. It's interesting, just as an aside, you say it's on YouTube, and earlier you said you saw different poets on YouTube, and it does seem that we know there's so many other ways of getting things out there, whereas for a while the poetry world was seen as quite a staid, people maybe, as you said, maybe academics and that, the way that they looked at it, but performance poetry and spoken word events just seem to be in such a healthy state at the moment. You do quite a lot of them, don't you? You do quite a lot of spoken word events and stuff.
I do. I'm blessed that people want to hear me read my poems.
But what's your experience of it at the moment? Because as someone who sits in the audience, it seems really in a good place in Scotland just now.
Yeah, I think, you know what? I feel like something has lined up and I've sort of come into being as a poet at exactly the right time, because there's so much stuff like Loud Poets in Edinburgh that are really like showcasing a spotlight on poetry, and I think maybe because there's a lot of spoken word stuff is quite political, and I think we're in a time now where people are reaching for political poetry because everything feels so hectic or overwhelming or just scary, in terms of the rise of the far right. And I think people are maybe seeing spoken word poets as a new way that they're engaging because of this political need just now. I think what's also lovely about being invited to read at all these spoken word events is that I get to meet so many other spoken word poets. And like there's some people like Iona Lee is just I just love Iona. I've seen her read it a couple of things, and I love, love, love her work, and how it captures this. There's this sort of like sly, dry humour to her stuff, but again, it's also very raw as well in some places. So yeah, it's really exciting to be a part of, and I feel very glad that I'm placed where I am, and that I get to be part of these.
Because people are, this is another thing, people are attending. When I started going to some poetry readings, you know, there was sometimes more people on stage than there was in the audience, unfortunately. But now, you know, events like the ones you're talking about, like Sonic Youth, are selling out and giving different people a voice, which I guess is what you're saying is happening at this moment.
And it's nice to see it as well in a sort of UK context, because I watched like a lot of button poets. So on YouTube there's like the button poetry, and it's great, and it was a great way to introduce me to spoken word. But it's always like American poets with that, and so it's really, really nice to see it in like a UK context and in like a Scottish context, especially where you're seeing people, you know, doing their poetry in Scots and stuff. And yeah, I just love it. I could speak about spoken word all day.
So you're talking about voices that maybe haven't been heard. You're on 404 Inc.
Yes.
And it does seem to me that they are doing exactly that. They're kind of, you know, with Chris's working class short stories, not just set in Glasgow, but specifically in East End of Glasgow. And you've got your own stuff. You also had the phenomenal success of Nasty Women, which seemed like a really defining publication. Not just for 404 Inc., I think in general, it really kind of captured the moment in time. And also there's the Queer Words anthology, We Were Always Here, which has just come out, I think, as well, but it's coming out. Is that a fair thing to say? Do you feel that that's what they're trying to do, or am I putting too much on this one?
No, I think 404 are very conscious and clear and transparent that they're trying to sort of not only shake things up in publishing, but that also they want to help give a platform to underrepresented voices. And I think they're very clear about that. And, you know, because I first worked with them on Nasty Women, and it's really interesting that, you know, I saw the call for Nasty Women submissions on Twitter, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to submit anything, I'll never get in, and, you know, all of this self-doubt. And then Heather McDade, actually, from 404, she saw me at an event reading a poem called Scott Mid, and she approached me, and she was like, please, can we have you in this anthology? And I think that's been my experience of them from start to finish, is that they have had this belief in me, and they have this belief in their authors, and they champion them. That's been, you know, incredibly supportive in that way. And it's not, you know, it's nice to work with an independent publisher, because I feel like it does feel like slightly more personal, you know. And for example, I was saying earlier, there's a poem in here called Girl Time in Let Me Tell You This, and when I was sat with Laura Jones going over the typesetting, she talked about how one of the lines in the poem is technically in publishing called a widow's line, where the line goes off the page. And for me, the poem Girl Time is about grief and loss, and so it just felt so perfect. And so yeah, I love that I've got that relationship with them where we can geek out about stuff. I can turn to them for support as well.
Well, I think that's a great term, because they clearly understand, you know, the publishing industry, and they want to change it, they want to do something new. And I think what you're saying about that personal relationship, that comes across with every, as far as I can tell, every project that they do, is that they will give their all to this project because they absolutely believe in it. And that's not always the case, I think, in publishing. So, you say you talk a lot about the spoken word scene. Is there anyone else that you would advise people to look out for that's around at the moment?
Just in Scotland, you mean? Or like, I could go global.
Yeah, you know? Global, we have people from all over.
So, like I kind of said at the start, I sort of started realising spoken word poetry from watching YouTube. And there's a poet who's an American poet called Andrea Gibson. And I think their work has got so much heart, but it also is so fiercely intelligent. And as an introduction to an example of this, I would encourage you to listen to their poem, Photoshopping My Sister's Mugshot. And I defy you to find a more intelligent poem. Like, it's stunning. But I think Andrea's work also gave me permission to realise that I could write in my own way and in my own voice, and write about these painful things, and write from the heart, and that's okay. Like I've said before, I'm a big fan of people like Holly McNish, I liked Caroline Bird a lot as well. I don't know if you've read
Yes,
her recent
yes,
collection. Yeah,
absolutely.
In These Days of Prohibition, just fantastic, phenomenal. I recently did a poetry workshop down in London with Rachel Long. So she's a poet based down south, and it was an intensive 2-day weekend on writing from intimate chaos. And the way that she just used free writing to structure that weekend completely opened something up inside of me. And I just felt so grateful for this community of poets that we can learn from.
So what's free writing?
So free writing is when you start writing, you're not allowed to stop. So it's literally like your pen isn't allowed to stop moving. So you can't, with free writing, it's about not consciously trying to craft something, but it's about letting go and just going with wherever it goes. And actually, I think there's something in that where you can really access this. It's almost like psychology, like you're accessing this little subconscious part of yourself whilst also learning about what you lean to in language. So for me, I realised through my free writing just how much I love rhyme, because even my free writing has a rhythm. And it's, to be honest, again, if we come back to the mental health, it's really good for you, I think, just to have that. I sometimes call it like doing your laundry, just to have that like offloading of just and see what comes from it. And there's a book called The Artist's Way where they talk about morning pages, where you sort of do a bit of free writing for something like 3 pages every morning. And it's good for you. It's good for the soul.
Well, that's really interesting. Going back to Let Me Tell You This, and what you just mentioned there, the idea of being lyrical and rhythm, because I think that runs through it as well. And you almost don't notice it. Oh, I didn't.
Yeah.
I was reading it, and then you find yourself that there's a rhythm to the words which almost kind of catch you unaware, I think. And I think, again, it's that idea that I felt they were really literary in a storytelling sense.
Thank you.
But yet there's a poetic, lyrical quality which runs through it. I think that is kind of what makes it a really special collection.
Thank you so much.
What's next for you, I suppose? Can you even say that? Because this is just out. It's a bit much to say what you're doing next, but
that's okay.
Let me change that question a little bit. What about your life as a poet? I think listeners would be interested to see just kind of what that entails.
My life as a poet.
Yeah.
I don't know if I prefer... The first one was easier.
Oh, well,
okay.
Go back to that if you like.
So I think for me there's always the question about money, isn't there? Right? And how you earn your money as a poet. And so sometimes I think I find the fact that I'm not... independently wealthy or a lottery winner, a slight barrier to be able to focus time on my writing. But certainly my new work, I decided last year, 2018, I'd pretty much finished the collection by March, and I'd decided that I was going to focus on prose for my year, which meant, of course, that suddenly all these poems started coming out of nowhere, as they do. So I've already started working on my next collection, or could be a pamphlet, I'm not sure yet, and it's all about letting go. So it's about whether it's saying goodbye to things, whether it's letting go of expectations on me as a poet, and expectations of the language that I use, expectations of what a poem should look like, but also letting go of things like the stigma around talking about mental health. I mean, I know Let Me Tell You This is quite an explicit collection, but I guess it's still me talking about things that I feel comfortable talking about. Yeah. Whereas, this journey to be more honest about mental health, I think, is coming through in my next collection. And I'm really enjoying how, as a poet in my journey, how I'm playing with form a lot more to express that experience. I'm really geeking out about that. But also I'm quite excited about some of my prose work that I've been doing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully at some point in the future getting the opportunity to dive straight into that. And I think what I find interesting is I think maybe as a writer, I'm a life writer overall, and it just comes out in different ways, but also that I'm a poet overall, and so even my prose sounds like a poem. In fact, sometimes I actually have to take out some of the rhythm because it's too much, because that's naturally who I am as a writer, and I find that quite exciting. I like that I can't take my poetry away from myself, even in my prose it's there. I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of absolutely part of you.
Yeah.
I think if you're getting up and without thinking, writing and a rhythm and a lyrical qualities coming through, then that's probably definitely the case. Can we get you to read, before we end?
Of course.
Could we get you to read Threads? Would that be okay? I know it's quite long, but it's such a beautiful poem.
No, it's always a pleasure. So Threads, yes, it's written about my grandmother, the time traveller, in the sense that she has Alzheimer's. And my grandmother was into dressmaking. She used to make all these knitted jumpers. In fact, you obviously can't see me because this is a podcast, but I in fact have one with me just now. And I've always felt in my family that there's this connection between sewing and women's histories and women's heritage. So this is Threads in celebration of her. At first, we thought it wasn't as bad as all that. Everyone forgets with age, and my grandmother always did have a taste for the dramatic. Now, over telephone static, your voice fades as fast as your memory. Threads of who you were offered to me, thin as loose cotton, stray from the weave and spiraled on your overcoat. Our conversations are limited. I can't ask you what you did yesterday or even this morning. Instead, I look for something to bind whatever you are able to bring to mind. I loop it like ribbon around the time between your thoughts arriving and leaving again. Today, that talk is dressmaking, which is somehow also your mother, in the sense that you think I'm your daughter. I wait for you to call me by her name. I don't know how to dressmake, but if I could, I'd sew a quilt with patches of the way the women in my mother's family all wear the same face, and I don't. Something in my lips has been unstitched from this pattern of Collins women, or is it Hinton or Udall or Emery? Maiden names made unchained and hidden in the seams. The author who could rewrite this invisibility, my grandmother. Instead, she is busy discovering a secret no one else knows, how to return to youth, how to bring the dead back to life, how to conquer time, until it's me who is caught behind, gathering frayed ends, trying to follow the chalk of her line as the present slips so far ahead that the moth-bitten past is all that we have left to see, and me, trying to use my words like stitches, afraid that without them we'll both be lost, and all I'll have is memories and cloth, the itch of wool against my skin that you once held and shaped, now resting gently on my frame, your needles clicking, your hands precise, your voice reminding me how to hold my tension, how to position my bias across the line, how to make something beautiful, something useful, from tangled yarn and threads. Everywhere I look, I find things I have inherited. Perhaps I'll gather this too. Perhaps I've already begun to unspool and make my journey through time. Maybe there I'll meet your fingers and join your thumb with mine. Measure the distance as if it were a simple bolt across which our two hands now span. A poem for your thoughts, a knitted jumper made in the same way. Threads meeting threads, meeting threads, meeting threads, picking up where we left off.
And if that doesn't convince you to buy a copy, let me tell you this, then nothing will.
Thank you.
Nadine, thank you so much for talking to us
Thank
today.
you for having me, Ali.
It's my pleasure, absolutely. And we'll be back soon with someone completely different. Cheers.